The crimson envelope now lay discarded, its contents, glossy, undeniable proofs of betrayal, scattered across the antique table. Seraphina stared, the vibrant images of Julian Vance, her Julian, with a stunning, unknown woman burning into her mind. The photographs spilled onto the polished wood like shards of broken glass, each one a dagger to Seraphina's heart. A strangled sob escaped her, raw and ragged. Disbelief warred with a cold, creeping certainty that tightened its icy grip around her, stealing her breath. This couldn't be Julian. Not the man whose laughter was the soundtrack to her happiest moments, whose touch was her safest harbor. Could it? The woman in the photos was laughing, her head thrown back, her hand possessively on Julian's arm. They were in a restaurant, candlelight glinting off her jewelry, off Julian's seemingly adoring eyes. Another photo showed them emerging from a hotel, linked arm in arm, their expressions intimate, sated. Each image was a fresh wave of nausea, a physical blow. Her mind, a maelstrom of confusion and pain, flashed back, seeking refuge in the sunlit memories of their beginning. Their eyes had first met across a crowded room at a glittering charity auction for a children's hospital. She, Seraphina Hayes, a quiet literature enthusiast with dreams of publishing her own poetry, had been volunteering, a little overwhelmed by the opulence, by the sheer voltage of wealth and power that crackled in the air. He, Julian Vance, the prodigy behind the sprawling tech empire Vance Corp Global, was the event's celebrated benefactor, a man whose face graced magazine covers and whose name was synonymous with innovation and ruthless success. In a moment of flustered distraction, navigating the throng with a tray of canapés, she'd stumbled, sending a flute of champagne cascading down the front of his impeccably tailored bespoke suit. Mortified, her apologies had tumbled out, a crimson blush staining her cheeks, certain she'd be dismissed, or worse. But Julian hadn't been angry. Instead, he'd thrown back his head and laughed, a rich, genuine sound that had disarmed her completely, echoing surprisingly warmly in the grand ballroom. "A memorable way to make an introduction," he'd said, his eyes, the color of warm whiskey, crinkling at the corners with an unexpected kindness. Perhaps fate has a rather dramatic sense of humor. There was an instant spark, an unlikely connection between the billionaire titan and the gentle poet. Their conversation that night had flowed effortlessly. From art, he'd surprised her with his insightful knowledge of obscure Renaissance painters, and philanthropy, his passion for the children's hospital, was palpable. To the very meaning of success, forging a bond that felt both sudden and profound. He'd listened, truly listened, when she spoke of her poetry, his gaze never wavering. What followed was a courtship straight from the pages of a romance novel, a whirlwind of breathtaking gestures that left Seraphina breathless and utterly captivated. Julian, it turned out, was a man of grand romantic flair when he chose to be. There were spontaneous helicopter rides that painted Nova City Central's glittering skyline beneath them. The sprawling metropolis, their private canvas as they sipped champagne, and he pointed out landmarks, his voice a low murmur against the thrum of the rotors. Midnight strolls through the hushed, moonlit paths of Lumina Park, where he'd confessed his fears and ambitions, the vulnerabilities hidden beneath the billionaire's armor, his voice a low rumble against the city's distant hum. He'd even once cut short a crucial international deal in Hong Kong, a deal worth millions, flying halfway across the world just to be home for her birthday, surprising her not with extravagant jewels, but with a single, perfect gardenia, her favorite, a flower whose delicate fragrance filled her small apartment for days. He'd loved her quiet strength, the way she saw the world through a poet's eyes, finding beauty in the mundane, a perspective so alien, yet so alluring to his own laser-focused, results-driven worldview. In turn, Seraphina had introduced Julian to a life beyond boardrooms and balance sheets, a world of simple, unpretentious joys. Picnics in the countryside with her parents, Arthur and Eleanor Hayes, filled with easy laughter, slightly burnt homemade scones, and stories of her childhood. Hours spent reading to children at the local Haydenwood District Library, her gentle voice weaving magic into old tales, Julian watching from the back, a rare soft smile playing on his lips. She grounded him, he often said, his hand covering hers, anchoring him to a reality far more genuine than the rarefied air of his corporate world. She was his calm in the storm, the quiet center of his universe. He'd told her once, his voice thick with emotion, his gaze intense. "You, Sarah, are my greatest acquisition." It had made her laugh, a light, tinkling sound, but the sincerity in his eyes, the depth of feeling, had been unmistakable, a promise she'd held close to her heart. Their wedding was an intimate affair, a stark contrast to the usual billionaire extravaganzas that splashed across society pages. They exchanged vows under a sprawling ancient oak tree in the gardens of his magnificent Silver Strand Bluffs estate, its branches reaching out like protective arms. A canopy of starlit blooms, jasmine and moonflowers, their scent intoxicating in the evening air, and thousands of twinkling fairy lights were their only witnesses, far from the prying lenses of the paparazzi he so despised. Seraphina, radiant in a simple, vintage-inspired lace gown that whispered of timeless elegance, had clutched a bouquet of wildflowers she'd picked herself that morning. Julian, dashing in a classic tuxedo, his usual formidable aura softened by an undeniable tenderness, had eyes only for her. Her father, Arthur, a retired music teacher with a gentle soul and eyes that mirrored Sarah's own kindness, had walked her down the petal-strewn aisle, tears of pride and a touch of understandable sorrow shining in his eyes as he gave his beloved daughter away. Guests, a small, carefully curated collection of their closest friends and family, still recalled Julian's vow, his voice uncharacteristically husky, thick with an emotion that vibrated through the quiet garden. "I promise to shield you from all storms, Seraphina, as you have sheltered me from the tempest of my own ambitions. You are my peace, my truth." It was so heartfelt, so raw, it left many dabbing at their eyes. Even Julian's stoic mother was seen discreetly wiping a tear. The union had felt blessed, a fairy tale come to life. For a time, it truly was. And soon, that fairy tale was to include another chapter. She was expecting their first child, a tiny precious secret they had cherished. A new bud of hope on their seemingly perfect love, a confirmation of their shared future. But paradise, it seemed, was not immune to serpents. And this one arrived in the devastatingly beautiful, impeccably dressed form of Isabel Izzy Thorne. Strikingly beautiful, with eyes like chips of obsidian that missed nothing and hair like spun moonlight that framed a face of cool, sculpted perfection. Isabel was Vance Corp Global's new, highly touted head of marketing. She possessed a razor-sharp intellect, a prestigious Harvard MBA, a resume that glittered with a string of audacious international successes, and an ambition that burned with a fierce, almost predatory gleam in her intelligent eyes. She was a woman who knew precisely what she wanted, and it soon became terrifyingly, sickeningly clear to anyone paying attention that what she wanted was Julian Vance, his power, his name, and everything that came with him. She moved through the Vance Corp Global offices like a sleek panther, her confidence a palpable force, her charm a carefully wielded weapon. Isabel's infiltration into Julian's professional life, and then, insidiously, with chilling precision, his personal space, was a masterpiece of calculated strategy. It began innocuously enough, with late-night strategy sessions in his sprawling, minimalist office on the top floor of the Vance Corp Tower, the city lights of Nova City Central a glittering, indifferent backdrop to her subtle machinations. She'd lean in close, ostensibly to point out a detail on a spreadsheet or a marketing plan. Her perfume, a heady, intoxicating blend of something exotic and expensive, a deliberate counterpoint to Seraphina's softer, more natural scents. Her voice, a low, confident purr, would praise his vision, his unparalleled genius, stroking his ego with the skill of a seasoned courtesan. She played the empath, appearing to understand the lonely burden of leadership, the immense pressure he was under as Vance Corp Global pushed relentlessly into new, volatile markets in Asia and Europe. "No one truly understands what it takes, Julian," she'd murmur, her eyes full of feigned sympathy. "The sacrifices you make." She was everything Seraphina wasn't, a creature of the corporate jungle, fluent in the cutthroat language of power and ambition, her energy a match for his own relentless drive. Julian, for all his brilliance and worldly success, was still a man. His love for Seraphina was a deep, foundational part of him, an anchor he believed was immutable. Yet, the relentless, soul-crushing demands of his empire were undeniably taking their toll. He was weary, stretched thin, the lines of stress more pronounced around his eyes. Isabel's targeted admiration was a potent balm to his increasingly frayed ego, her shared corporate fervor a refreshing, if dangerous, change from the quiet, contemplative, literary world Seraphina inhabited. He found himself lingering after meetings, drawn into conversations that were intellectually stimulating, yes, but also charged with an unspoken perilous energy. He found himself thinking about the encrypted USB drive more often, the one tucked away in his private office safe. It wasn't just about the sensitive merger documents for the colossal acquisition that could either solidify his legacy or shatter his company. It represented the immense weight on his shoulders, the secrets and strategies that he couldn't share. Not even with Sarah. The stress was immense. The nights often sleepless, filled with pacing and endless scenarios. And Isabel was always there. A seemingly supportive colleague, a keen strategist, her presence a constant, subtle temptation. Or so he told himself, ignoring the warning bells that had begun to toll faintly in the recesses of his conscience. She'd find subtle ways to make him stay. An impromptu brainstorming session that stretched late into the evening, an urgent query that required his immediate attention over coffee, that somehow, almost inevitably, turned into dinner at some discreet, expensive restaurant. If Seraphina texted or called during these extended work hours, her gentle inquiries about his day, her soft reminders to eat, to rest, often went unanswered or were dismissed later with a curt, impatient, "In a meeting, Sarah. Can't talk." He rationalized it, burying the guilt deep down. It was work. It was important for their future. For her future and the baby's. Wasn't it? The true unraveling, the first definitive tear in the fabric of their marriage, began in Viridia City, the jewel of the continent, a city of art, romance, and now, for Julian, of transgression. It was during a high-stakes corporate gala, an opulent affair teeming with international financiers and industry titans. Vance Corp Global was on the cusp of a monumental deal, a merger that would redefine the tech landscape, and the pressure on Julian was immense, almost unbearable. He found himself confiding in Isabel, the carefully constructed dam of his composure finally cracking. The strain was evident in his voice, the exhaustion etched deeply onto his handsome features. She listened, her gaze intense, unwavering, her hand resting lightly, reassuringly on his arm. A touch that lingered just a fraction too long. One shared drink to de-stress. A potent cocktail that did little to ease the tension but certainly lowered inhibitions, led to another. Laughter, a little too loud, a little too free, a shared glance that held a dangerous spark. Later, when the gala began to wind down, she suggested a walk, a moonlit stroll along the serene banks of the Vidian River, the city's ancient architecture a romantic, almost dreamlike silhouette against the inky sky. The air was soft, scented with night-blooming jasmine. And then the stolen kiss, or perhaps not so stolen. It tasted of expensive wine, of recklessness, of impending doom, a line crossed irrevocably. The world for Julian tilted on its axis. Guilt, sharp and immediate, a visceral sickness, gnawed at Julian's conscience. He loved Seraphina. She was his wife, the woman carrying his child, his anchor, the gentle soul who had brought light into his often shadowed world. What had he done? But the thrill, oh God, the thrill of Isabel's brazen confidence, their shared, almost feverish ambition, the sheer intoxicating newness of her attention, it pulled him closer, a moth to a dangerous, alluring flame. He was a man caught in a current, too weak, or perhaps in that moment of exhilarating recklessness, too willing to swim against it. This wasn't just about a kiss, he knew with a sinking heart. This was a betrayal that cut to the very core of who he thought he was, of what he believed he valued. When Julian returned to Nova City Central, to the opulent, art-filled penthouse he shared with Seraphina, he carried more than just his designer luggage and a briefcase full of deal notes. The faint, exotic scent of Isabel's perfume, something dark and musky, a blend of sandalwood and something unnamably provocative, so unlike Seraphina's light, ethereal fragrance of white tea and gardenias, clung to his clothes like an invisible, damning accusation. He was distant, his eyes holding a new, unreadable shadow, a haunted quality she'd never seen before. Seraphina, perceptive and deeply attuned to her husband's moods, a skill honed over years of loving him, noticed the shift immediately. It wasn't just tiredness, it was a wall, suddenly erected between them. That evening, as he stared blankly at a financial report projected onto the wall of his study, a tumbler of expensive amber liquid untouched beside him, she approached him, her heart aflutter with a nascent, sickening anxiety. "Julian," she began, her voice soft, hesitant, laced with a concern he no longer seemed to register, a concern that felt almost intrusive in the sudden chill of the room. "Is everything all right? You seem different, far away." He flinched almost imperceptibly, his shoulders tensing before he schooled his features into a semblance of normality, a mask that didn't quite fit. "Fine, Sarah, just tired. These big deals, they take it out of you, you know how it is." He attempted a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He brushed a cursory kiss on her forehead, a gesture that once would have melted her heart, but now felt cold, perfunctory, dismissive. He avoided her gaze, his eyes flicking to the screen, then back to his drink, anywhere but at her searching, loving face. As he turned and walked back towards his study, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind him with a sound of unnerving finality, Seraphina clutched her stomach, a protective instinct kicking in, where their child lay nestled, blissfully unaware of the storm gathering outside. A cold knot of dread, sharp and painful, tightened within her. This wasn't just tiredness. This was something else. Something wrong. She whispered to the silent, opulent room, the city lights twinkling mockingly outside their panoramic windows, creating a beautiful, deceptive illusion of peace. "Who are you becoming, Julian?" The question hung in the air unanswered, a harbinger of the devastating storm that was about to break, a storm that threatened to obliterate everything she held dear. Julian's evasiveness was a cold shard of ice in Seraphina's heart. Days turned into weeks, each one filled with a growing chasm between them. A silence punctuated only by his late arrivals and the faint, unfamiliar scent that clung to him like a shroud. The city's elite circles, always hungry for a new tidbit of gossip, buzzed with more than just stock prices and market fluctuations. Illicit whispers of Julian Vance's new associate, the dazzling Isabel Thorne, began to snake their insidious way to Seraphina. At first, they were just that. Whispers, easily dismissed as the envious chatter of those who resented Julian's Midas touch or their seemingly perfect life. How could they know anything about her, Julian, about the depth of their connection? It was unthinkable. Julian, the man who had once flown across continents just for her birthday, entangled with another? No. Impossible. Seraphina tried to dismiss her fears, to silence the nagging anxieties that clawed at the edges of her mind like persistent, unwelcome cats. She clung desperately to the memories of Julian's unwavering love, his grand gestures, his quiet reassurances that she was his world, his everything. She even found herself thinking more frequently about the small, anonymous grant she'd received for her poetry years ago, just as she was starting out, a sum that had felt like a fortune then, allowing her to dedicate precious, uninterrupted months to her craft. It had arrived with a simple, typewritten note for the words that deserved to be heard. No signature, no return address. She'd always cherished it as a sign, a validation from the universe itself. When she'd excitedly told Julian about it, he'd smiled, a quick, almost distracted flash of pleasure for her success, but had seemed oddly uninterested in its origins, almost dismissive. "Some wealthy patron with good taste, no doubt, darling," he'd said with a characteristic shrug, his mind already on some complex algorithm or impending Vance Corp global deal that consumed his waking hours. "Don't trouble yourself with who, just use it well." Now, recalling his reaction, the casualness of it, a tiny uncomfortable question mark formed in her mind. Could he have known more? Or was it just another instance of his monumental focus being elsewhere, his world so vast that such a grant, life-changing for her, was a mere blip to him? The thought was unsettling, adding another almost imperceptible layer to her growing unease, like fine dust settling on a once pristine surface. Her friend, Genevieve Croft, a well-connected society columnist with a razor-sharp wit, a penchant for both vintage champagne and fresh scandal, and an almost maternal affection for Seraphina, tried to gently, cautiously warn her. Over lunch at their favorite sun-drenched café, Le Petit Jardin, amidst the cheerful clatter of cutlery and the low murmur of polite lunchtime conversation, Genevieve had leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Sarah, darling." She'd begun, her usually bright, mischievous eyes clouded with an uncharacteristic concern. I saw Julian with Isabel Thorne at the Onyx Room last night." The Onyx Room. Even Seraphina, who generally avoided the city's more decadent haunts, knew its reputation. It was an exclusive, dimly lit downtown lounge, all black leather and hushed tones, notorious for clandestine meetings, high-stakes deals, and illicit rendezvous of the city's powerful and restless. They looked, well, darling, Genevieve continued, her perfectly manicured hand covering Sarah's for a moment. They looked far too comfortable, far too intimate for just colleagues. Genevieve had squeezed her hand. Please, just be aware. Keep your eyes open, sweetie. That Thorne woman, she has a reputation. A man-eater, they say, with an ambition that could curdle cream. Seraphina had felt a cold fist clench around her heart, a sickening lurch in her stomach, but she'd forced a brittle, too bright smile. Oh, Jen, you know what gossips people are. You shouldn't listen to them. Julian and Isabel are working on a huge new branding campaign for the Asian markets. It's incredibly high pressure, round-the-clock stuff. They're probably just exhausted and unwinding after a brutal strategy session. She'd fiercely defended Julian, her loyalty an automatic ingrained shield against the unwelcome, terrifying truth. But Genevieve's words, the genuine pity in her friend's eyes, lingered like a poisonous residue, a bitter aftertaste to the expensive Sancerre they were sharing. Then came the tabloids, the vultures of public life. Scurrilous online rags at first, the kind that thrived on innuendo and manufactured outrage. Then even some of the more reputable gossip sites began publishing grainy, long-lens photographs of Julian and Isabel. There they were, exiting a private elevator at a 5-star boutique hotel in the early hours of the morning, Isabel's hand tucked possessively in the crook of Julian's arm, her head tilted towards him, a smug smile playing on her lips. Another showed them laughing together in the back of Julian's chauffeured Maybach, their heads close, Isabel's eyes sparkling up at him with an unmistakable intimacy. The captions were coy, dripping with insinuation. Billionaire CEO Julian Vance and his strategic advisor burning the midnight oil? Or Vance Corp's hottest new power duo? Insiders whisper, it's more than just business. Each image, each slyly worded headline that flashed across her social media feed, was another cut, another chip at Seraphina's carefully constructed denial, the foundation of her world trembling beneath her feet. She finally confronted Julian one evening, her voice trembling but firm, the offending tablet clutched in her shaking hand, displaying a particularly damning photo of him and Isabel, their silhouettes framed against the window of a dimly lit restaurant, clearly sharing more than just a meal. Julian, what is this? Who is she to you? Really? Tell me the truth. He'd turned from the panoramic window of their penthouse, where he'd been staring out at the indifferent city lights, his expression unreadable for a long moment before it hardened into that familiar mask of corporate impatience, the one he used with underlings and adversaries. Seraphina, for God's sake, don't be ridiculous. Isabel Thorne is a vital part of my team, a brilliant strategist. We're in the middle of negotiating multi-billion-dollar deals in Asia, deals that will secure our future. Your future. These things require absolute discretion, late nights, intense focus. You know the pressures of Vance Corp. He ran an agitated hand through his already disheveled dark hair. The paparazzi are vultures. They twist everything to sell their sordid stories. You should know better than to believe such trash. His defensiveness, his outright refusal to meet her gaze directly, his immediate deflection to her supposed naivety only fueled her growing dread. It wasn't what he said, it was what he didn't say. The hollowness in his voice. He then tried to placate her, to smooth over the cracks that were rapidly appearing in their carefully polished facade. He presented her with a beautifully wrapped gift, a rare, signed first edition of Elias Thorne's poetry, her absolute favorite poet, a literary treasure she'd long coveted and often spoken of. For you, my love, he'd murmured, his voice softer now, an attempt at the old tenderness. To show you, you're always on my mind, even when I'm consumed by this. The gesture, so typically Julian in its extravagance and apparent thoughtfulness, momentarily soothed her, a brief, deceptive respite from the storm of her emotions. But as she held the cool, smooth, leather-bound volume, its pages filled with words that had once brought her such comfort, the gesture felt less like a token of genuine love, and more like the heavy, ornate bars of a gilded cage, a beautiful, expensive distraction from an ugly, festering truth. Was this how he kept her quiet? With expensive, perfectly chosen trinkets, while his attention, his heart, strayed elsewhere? The thought was a fresh stab of pain. Desperate to salvage what she felt was slipping away, to recapture the magic they once shared, Seraphina suggested a romantic getaway to their secluded Silverstrand Bluffs estate, the place where they'd exchange their vows under the ancient oak, a sanctuary of happy memories and whispered promises. To her surprise and immense relief, Julian agreed, a flicker of the old warmth, the Julian she knew and loved, returning to his eyes. For one fleeting, sun-drenched weekend, they rediscovered their bond, or so it seemed. They walked hand in hand along the deserted, wind-swept beach, the rhythmic roar of the waves a counterpoint to their quiet conversation. They talked, truly talked, for the first time in what felt like months. Julian admitted the crushing stress of the Asian expansion, the relentless pressure from the Vance Corp board, his deep-seated fear of failure, of not living up to the towering expectations he and the world had set for him. Seraphina listened, her heart aching for him, for them, and promised her unwavering support, her hand finding his. "We can get through anything, Julian," she'd whispered, her head resting on his shoulder as they watched the sunset paint the sky in breathtaking hues of fire and rose, the ocean breeze tugging at her hair. "As long as we're together, as long as we have each other, nothing else matters." Hope, fragile but tenacious, flickered within her breast. Perhaps this was just a rough patch, a storm they could weather. Perhaps they could find their way back to each other. She prayed it was so. But back in the relentless, unforgiving glare of Nova City, Isabel Thorne was not one to be sidelined or forgotten. Sensing, perhaps, with her acute, predatory instincts, that she was losing ground after Julian's restorative weekend with his wife, she escalated her efforts with a ruthless, chilling efficiency. She manufactured one urgent crisis after another, demanding Julian's presence for late-night meetings, for weekend strategy sessions, all to finalize the critical Asian market penetration strategy. "The Tokyo deal is on a knife edge, Julian. Their chief negotiator is threatening to walk. We need to rework the entire proposal by morning or we lose billions," she'd hiss down the phone, her voice a carefully calibrated mix of urgency and feigned panic. Or it would be, "The Beijing investors are getting cold feet about the regulatory hurdles. I need you here to strategize now. They only trust your word on this." Seraphina found herself alone in their vast, silent penthouse more and more frequently, the silence amplifying her anxieties, her earlier hopes dimming with each unanswered call, each curt text message from Julian. His calls, when they came, became shorter, his excuses flimsier, his patience thinner. The warmth of their Silverstrand Bluffs weekend felt like a distant, fading dream. A cruel mirage in the desolate landscape their marriage was fast becoming. Isabel's best friend and occasional confidant, Maya Jensen, a sharp-tongued, equally ambitious PR executive with a deeply cynical view of romance, an even deeper loyalty to Isabel, listened as Isabel fumed over cocktails at a chic, exclusive bar overlooking the glittering city. He spent the entire bloody weekend playing house with Little Miss Poetry. Isabel seethed, swirling the ice in her nearly empty martini with a vicious, stabbing motion. "Can you believe it? After everything? After Viridia City? He practically begged me to stay that night." Her eyes, usually so coolly calculating, flashed with a possessive, dangerous fury. "I'm done waiting, Maya. I'm done being his dirty little secret, his convenient escape. If he won't choose, then I'll force his hand. Seraphina needs to know the truth, the whole truth." It's almost an act of charity, don't you think? Putting her out of her blissful, pathetic ignorance. Maya raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow, a silent question in her gaze, but said nothing, long accustomed to Isabel's dramatic pronouncements and her friend's unwavering, ruthless ambition. She knew that look in Isabel's eye. The game was about to enter its endgame. And so, Isabel began to meticulously, almost lovingly, collect her arsenal of evidence. Intimate selfies taken in opulent hotel rooms, their faces flushed with champagne and illicit passion, Julian's arm draped carelessly, possessively, around her bare shoulders. Copies of receipts from clandestine dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, documenting exorbitant champagne charges that would make a sultan blush, dates and times circled with a vindictive flourish. She even, with chilling foresight and a complete lack of compunction, managed to retrieve a short, damning audio recording from her phone. a snippet of a hushed, late-night conversation. Julian's voice, thick with a desire Seraphina hadn't heard directed at her in months, murmuring Isabel's name, followed by whispered promises he clearly never intended to keep with his wife. Promises of a future that didn't include Seraphina. One evening, while Julian was supposedly engrossed in a crucial international conference call in his home study, a call Isabel herself had orchestrated to ensure his distraction, Isabel, a guest in their home under the guise of a critical work session, made a daring, brazen move. She subtly attempted to access his personal laptop, which he'd carelessly left open on his desk, her fingers flying over the keyboard with practiced ease, searching for anything else she could use, perhaps even information related to the highly sensitive, encrypted USB drive she knew he kept locked away in his private safe, a drive rumored to contain the keys to his entire kingdom. She didn't succeed in accessing the drive's contents that night. Julian's digital security was, unsurprisingly, too sophisticated even for her considerable skills. But the audacious attempt itself spoke volumes about her nerve, her utter lack of boundaries, her willingness to go to any lengths to achieve her objective. She was playing for keeps, and the stakes were impossibly high. Finally, her damning collection complete, Isabel sat at her minimalist glass desk in her own sleek, modern apartment, a venomous, triumphant smile playing on her perfectly painted lips. She took a plain brown manila envelope, chillingly similar in its stark anonymity to the crimson one that had first heralded disaster for Seraphina, yet somehow more brutal in its stark, unadorned utility. Into it she slid the carefully curated selection of damning, irrefutable proof. The glossy photographs, the damning texts that painted a vivid picture of betrayal, the intimate audio recording that would leave no room for doubt. And as a final, cruel flourish, a masterstroke of psychological warfare, she penned a short, spiky note on expensive, cream-colored cardstock in a bold, decisive, almost masculine hand. "He says he loves you. Ask him about us. Ask him about last night, a concerned friend." The anonymity, she knew, would be all the more insidious. Isabel sealed the envelope with a decisive, satisfied lick, a chilling smile of pure, unadulterated satisfaction still gracing her features. "Consider this my official introduction, Mrs. Vance," she murmured to the sealed package, holding it up as if toasting a victory, "and my resignation from the uncomfortable, inconvenient shadows." She then handed it to a discreet, anonymous courier, a man who asked no questions and left no trace, with very specific, untraceable instructions for its immediate delivery to Miss Seraphina Hayes at her private residence, ensuring it would bypass any of Julian's ever-watchful, fiercely loyal staff or well-meaning, protective gatekeepers. The fuse had been meticulously lit. The explosion was now, finally, imminent. The courier, a nondescript man in a plain jacket, handed Seraphina the brown envelope with an impassive expression. "Urgent for Miss Hayes," he'd said, his voice flat, before disappearing as quickly as he came, melting back into the city's indifferent bustle. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This felt different, heavier, more ominous than the crimson one that had first shattered her peace. That one had been a prelude. This, she sensed with a sickening certainty, was the main act, the final, brutal reveal. The doorbell, just moments before, had chimed, a cheerful, incongruous sound on what was about to become the darkest, most desolate day of Seraphina's carefully curated life. A life that was, in a few horrifying moments, about to implode. She was in her sun-drenched sanctuary, the airy, book-lined study overlooking the vibrant chaos of Nova City Central, a space usually filled with the quiet hum of creativity. Her poetry manuscript, tentatively titled Echoes of a Shattered Dawn, a title that now felt chillingly prescient, lay open on her antique mahogany desk. The words, once her solace, now seemed to mock her. With trembling fingers, she tore open the plain brown envelope. The contents, more glossy photographs, starker this time, more undeniably intimate. Printouts of text messages, their banal endearments and clandestine plans, a vulgar contrast to the love notes Julian used to leave her. A crumpled hotel receipt from a discreet boutique establishment in Viridia City, dated just last week. The room service charges, including 2 champagne flutes and a single red rose, were undeniable, irrefutable. Her world, the carefully constructed edifice of her marriage, her love, her future, imploded with the force of a controlled demolition. leaving nothing but dust and jagged, unrecognizable ruins. A wave of nausea, so violent it buckled her knees, washed over her. The room tilted, the elegant cream walls seeming to close in. A silent scream, a primal sound of agony and betrayal, was trapped in her throat, choking her. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely hold the damning evidence. Each photo, each word, hammered home the brutal truth with the force of a physical blow. Julian, her Julian. Living a double life, a life of deceit and whispered assignations, while she, his pregnant wife, waited at home, her heart filled with love and a naive, trusting faith. How could he? How could this be happening? Her desperate, frantic calls to Julian's private line, then his office, then his personal assistant, Liam Bryant, all went straight to voicemail. Each unanswered ring a fresh twist of the knife in her already bleeding heart. Finally, her voice choked with unshed tears, a quivering whisper of pain, she left a single, stark message. Julian, come home, now, we need to talk. Hours later, an eternity of agonizing suspense, Julian finally arrived at the penthouse. He was drenched from a sudden downpour, his usually immaculate suit rumpled, his expression clearly irritated. "What on earth is so urgent, Sarah?" he demanded, shrugging out of his wet trench coat, oblivious to the devastation that radiated from her like a physical force. "I was in the middle of a critical negotiation with the Singaporean VCs. Couldn't this have waited?" His tone was sharp, impatient, the tone he used when a subordinate had failed him. Seraphina didn't speak. Words seemed inadequate, hollow. She simply, numbly handed him the brown envelope and watched, her heart a cold, dead weight in her chest, as his face transformed. Annoyance morphed into confusion, then dawning comprehension, then a ghastly, ashen horror, and finally a crushing, undeniable shame that seemed to bow his broad shoulders. His eyes, those whiskey-warm eyes she had loved so fiercely, darted between the damning photos, the incriminating texts, then up to meet her gaze, a gaze now stripped bare of all illusion, filled only with a profound, glacial sorrow. He tried to form words, to offer some explanation, some denial, but they stuck in his throat, a strangled, pathetic sound. Silence, thick and suffocating, stretched between them, broken only by the distant wail of a city siren and the relentless drumming of rain against the panoramic windows. Finally, her voice, when it came, was a stranger to her own ears. Cold, brittle, devoid of all inflection, each word laced with the icy shards of heartbreak. "How long, Julian?" He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing convulsively. "Sarah, I can explain." "Explain?" A bitter, humorless laugh escaped her lips, a sound like breaking glass. "Explain this?" She gestured to the scattered evidence of his betrayal. "Don't bother lying, Julian. Not anymore. You're with her, aren't you? Isabel Thorne." Her voice was flat, accusatory. "These photos? Why would someone send them to me? Unless they wanted me to know. Unless she wanted me to know." He closed his eyes, a spasm of pain crossing his features. The bravado, the corporate bluster had vanished, leaving behind a man looking small and defeated and utterly contemptible. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I never meant for you to find out like this. I never meant to hurt you." Anger, white-hot and cleansing, battled with the overwhelming sorrow within her. "You're sorry I found out? Or you're sorry you did it, Julian?" She took a step back as he tried to approach her, his arms outstretched in a feeble, pathetic attempt to comfort, to bridge the now unbridgeable chasm between them. "Don't touch me." "I still love you, Sarah," he pleaded, his voice cracking. It just happened. A mistake. A terrible mistake." "A mistake?" She stepped back again, tears finally breaking free, streaking down her face, hot and furious. "No, Julian, it didn't just happen. You chose it. You chose her. While I was here, waiting for you, loving you, pregnant with your child, you were choosing her, again and again." A bitter, incredulous laugh escaped her lips. "All this time, I thought we just needed to reconnect, that we could fix things if we just tried harder. And meanwhile, you were with Isabel Thorne, behind my back, laughing at me, at my naivety." "Let me explain, please," he pleaded, his own eyes now suspiciously bright. "I love you, Seraphina. I swear this thing with Isabel, it meant nothing." She cut him off, her voice shaking with a rage that was terrifying in its intensity. "I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear your lies, your excuses. Not anymore." Turning on her heel, her body trembling with the force of her emotions, she fled to the guest room. The opulent master suite now a monument to their shattered vows, slamming the door with a resounding crack that echoed the breaking of her heart. The end of their life together. In that moment, Julian Vance, the billionaire titan, the master of his universe, finally understood. A monumental, irrevocable shift had just occurred. This was no petty argument, no lover's tiff to be smoothed over with expensive gifts or facile apologies. The sanctity of their marriage had been desecrated, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. And he, in his arrogance, his weakness, his monumental folly, had no clue how to even begin to piece it back together. He had destroyed everything that truly mattered. Meanwhile, across town, in her sleek, minimalist apartment, Isabel Thorne, blissfully unaware of the true depth of the devastation she had unleashed, placed a call to Julian. She expected to hear triumph in his voice, perhaps even relief. Instead, she heard only a broken, hollow despair. "Why, Isabel? Why would you do this to her? To Seraphina?" His voice was raw, ragged with a pain she hadn't anticipated, and frankly, didn't care about. Her reply was as cold and sharp as ice. "You wouldn't make a choice, Julian. You were trying to have it all. I simply facilitated the decision-making process. Now we can finally be together, out in the open. No more sneaking around." Her voice held a note of possessive triumph. Julian recoiled as if struck. For the first time he saw Isabel's ambition laid bare, stripped of its seductive veneer, and it was a chilling, ugly sight. "There is no us, Isabel," he whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. There never truly was. He ended the call, leaving Isabel staring at her phone in stunned, furious disbelief, her carefully constructed victory suddenly feeling a little less sweet, a little more hollow. The next morning, as a pale, watery dawn broke over the indifferent city, Seraphina emerged from the guest room. Her eyes were swollen, her face pale, but set in an expression of grim resolve. She carried a single, small suitcase. Julian, who had kept a sleepless vigil outside her door, his pleas and apologies unanswered, looked up, his face a mask of haggard despair. She refused to meet his eyes. Without a word, she summoned the private elevator and left the opulent penthouse, the gilded cage that had become her prison, without a backward glance. Over the next few days, the world exploded. "Vance Billionaire's marriage crumbles amidst scandal," screamed the headlines. "Tech Titan's torrid affair exposed." Paparazzi, like a pack of hungry wolves, hounded Seraphina, camped outside her parents' modest suburban home where she had sought refuge. Arthur Hayes, her gentle father, was livid, his usual mild demeanor replaced by a protective fury. Eleanor, her mother, was simply heartbroken, her quiet tears a testament to the trust that had been so cruelly betrayed. "We trusted him, Sarah," she'd whispered, her voice cracking as she held her weeping daughter. "We thought he would cherish you." Seraphina, moving through a fog of pain and public humiliation, knew she had to act. She contacted Lenora DeVries, a formidable, take-no-prisoners divorce attorney renowned for her discretion and her ruthless efficiency in dismantling the empires of unfaithful husbands. Their first meeting took place in DeVries's starkly elegant Nova City Central office. Julian arrived first, looking like a ghost of his former self, haggard, dark circles under his eyes, his expensive suit hanging limply on his frame. He seemed to have aged a decade in a single devastating week. The air in the conference room was thick with unspoken accusations and palpable grief. When Lenora DeVries began to outline the potential for a very generous settlement, given Julian's flagrant adultery and vast wealth, Seraphina held up a hand, her voice surprisingly steady. "Miss DeVries," she said, her gaze fixed on a point beyond Julian's bowed head, "I appreciate your diligence, but I don't want his money. Not a penny more than is necessary for practicalities." A tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. "I want a clean break. I want my name back. I want to continue my oversight of the Vance Hayes initiative, because that was ours, and it matters." Her dignity, even in the face of such profound betrayal, was breathtaking. Julian, his face ashen, could only nod his agreement to all terms, his remorse a raw, gaping wound. He was desperate to end her pain, the pain he had so carelessly inflicted. The meeting ended. As they exited the imposing law office building onto the bustling Nova City street, the cacophony of the city a jarring contrast to the funereal silence that had enveloped them, Julian made one last, desperate attempt. "Sarah," he pleaded, his hand reaching for her arm, a touch she instinctively recoiled from. Sarah, I'm so sorry. For everything, I don't expect you to forgive me. But if there's any chance, anything I can do. She finally looked at him then, her beautiful eyes, once so full of love and adoration for him, now filled with an ocean of tears and an unutterable sadness. She slowly shook her head, the tears sliding unchecked down her pale cheeks. There isn't, Julian, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the city's roar. There's nothing left to say. Goodbye, Julian. And with that, she turned and walked away, hailed a taxi, and disappeared into the stream of yellow cabs, leaving him standing alone on the sidewalk, the city lights beginning to blur through his own unshed tears. Inside the taxi, as the cityscape blurred past, a single defiant sob escaped Seraphina. But then she straightened her shoulders, a tiny nascent spark of resilience igniting within the desolate landscape of her heart. He will not break me, she vowed silently, clutching the worn leather-bound journal that held the first raw verses of Echoes of a Shattered Dawn. He will not break me. The path ahead was uncertain, shrouded in mist and pain, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like her own. As the taxi speeds away from the opulent towers of Nova City Central, leaving behind the glittering cage of her marriage, Seraphina clutches a small, worn notebook to her chest. Inside, the first lines of Echoes of a Shattered Dawn are already taking shape, a testament to the storm she's weathered and the unknown shores ahead. A new chapter, penned in her own ink, was about to begin. 2 years later, the name Seraphina Hayes, once a society footnote, a quiet appendage to the dazzling Julian Vance, was now whispered with a hushed admiration in literary circles, while Julian Vance himself remained a king on a visibly crumbling throne of regret. Time, the great healer, the relentless river, had forged new landscapes from the wreckage of their old world. Seraphina had found her sanctuary, not in another grand estate or a high-rise apartment with soulless panoramic views, but in a modest, sun-dappled apartment nestled on a quiet, tree-lined street in the Havenwood district. It was small, perhaps a little shabby around the edges, but it was hers. Books overflowed from every shelf, spilling onto tables and chairs, a testament to her enduring love for the written word. Sunlight, unfiltered and warm, streamed through the large casement windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air and casting a golden glow on the worn velvet armchair where she spent hours writing, her faithful rescue greyhound Griffin asleep at her feet. Her poetry collection, the raw, searingly honest Echoes of a Shattered Dawn, had been published by a respected independent press and had become an unexpected, quiet, critical success. Critics lauded its emotional depth, its unflinching portrayal of heartbreak, betrayal, and the slow, arduous journey towards healing. She had dedicated it simply for those who find strength in the broken places. Her closest friend, the vibrant and fiercely loyal Chloe Sharma, a textile designer with a booming laugh and an even bigger heart, had been her rock throughout the agonizing divorce and its aftermath. A constant source of unwavering support, practical advice, and late-night ice cream therapy sessions. Chloe had been the one to drag her to open mic nights, to encourage her to submit her manuscript, to remind her again and again that her voice deserved to be heard. Occasionally, Seraphina would catch glimpses of Julian in the relentless churn of the city's news cycle. A paparazzi shot of him leaving a high-profile board meeting, looking gaunt, the once arrogant set of his jaw now tinged with a weary sadness. News of his increased, almost frantic philanthropic work through the Vance Hayes Initiative, the foundation they had established together in happier times, which he had significantly expanded, almost as if trying to buy back some measure of his lost soul. He'd poured millions into arts programs for underprivileged youth, into literacy campaigns, into everything she had once championed. It was a public penance, perhaps, but it brought her no solace, only a dull, persistent ache for the man he might have been, for the dream they had almost built. His haunted look in those candid photographs was a world away from the confident, charismatic titan she had married. He looked diminished. And what of Isabel Thorne, the architect of so much destruction? Her downfall, when it came, was swift and ignominious. Whispers of her manipulative tactics at Vance Corp Global, her ruthless ambition that often crossed ethical lines, began to surface. Perhaps a past victim, emboldened by the public scandal of Julian's affair, had finally come forward with irrefutable proof to the board. Or perhaps Julian himself, in a belated act of cleansing, had exposed her. Whatever the catalyst, Isabel had resigned in disgrace, vanishing from the glittering social scene and the high-powered corporate world as quickly as she had appeared. Rumor had it she'd taken a lesser position with a firm overseas, her reputation in Nova City Central in tatters. She became a footnote, a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones in boardrooms and at cocktail parties. Good riddance, Seraphina thought, with a surprising lack of malice. Isabel had been a symptom, not the disease. The disease had been within her marriage, within Julian, perhaps even within herself for not seeing the cracks sooner. Julian, tormented by a regret that was a constant, gnawing companion, finally sought help. At the firm insistence of his board, who were increasingly concerned by his erratic behavior and disengagement from the day-to-day running of Vance Corp Global, he hired a no-nonsense executive coach, Marcus Holloway. Holloway, a blunt, insightful man utterly unintimidated by Julian's billions or his formidable reputation, cut through the layers of denial and self-pity. "Are you going to spend the rest of your life wallowing in this, Mr. Vance?" Holloway had asked in their first session, his gaze unwavering. "Or are you going to figure out how to salvage something from the wreckage? Not your company, yourself." Holloway's words, brutal but necessary, pushed Julian into therapy, a path he would once have scorned as a sign of weakness. The sessions were agonizing, peeling back layers of guilt, arrogance, and profound self-deception. He was forced to confront not just the affair, but the slow, insidious neglect of his marriage, the countless ways he had prioritized his ambition, his empire, over the quiet, steadfast love Seraphina had offered him. His therapist, a kind, insightful woman named Dr. Evans, encouraged him to write a letter to Seraphina, to articulate his remorse, his unspoken apologies, whether he ever chose to send it or not. For hours one rain-swept evening, alone in the vast, echoing silence of the penthouse that was now just a monument to his failures, Julian poured his heart out onto paper. He wrote of his regret, his shame, his admiration for her strength and dignity in the face of his catastrophic betrayal. He confessed how much he missed her quiet presence, her gentle smile, the way her unwavering kindness used to center him, to ground him in a world that often felt too harsh, too demanding. He wrote of his folly in chasing fleeting thrills, in allowing his ego and ambition to overshadow the one true, precious thing in his life. He sealed the letter, his hand trembling, and placed it in a locked drawer in his desk, a tangible symbol of his unspoken atonement, a confession he hadn't yet found the courage to make. One of the Vance Hayes Initiative scholarship recipients, a gifted young poet from an underprivileged background named Nina Chen, publicly praised Seraphina's mentorship and unwavering belief in her talent during an award ceremony. A video clip of Nina's heartfelt speech, her voice thick with emotion as she thanked Miss Seraphina Hayes, who saw a poet in me when no one else did, went viral. Julian saw it. It was like a dagger to his heart, a stark reminder of Seraphina's grace, her generosity, her passion for nurturing young talent, qualities he had so carelessly discarded. Where Isabel had been driven by a rapacious hunger for power, Seraphina had always been motivated by a quiet, profound compassion. The contrast was a fresh source of agony. Seraphina, meanwhile, continued to rebuild her life. One word, one poem, one small act of courage at a time. She gave a poetry reading at a small independent bookstore cafe in the Havenwood district, the Wandering Quill. She was nervous, her hands trembling as she clutched her book, but as she began to read her verses aloud, words born of pain, of loss, but also of resilience and a dawning hope, her voice grew stronger, more confident. The small audience listened, rapt, some with tears in their eyes. Afterwards, as she sipped a calming chamomile tea, Genevieve Croft, ever supportive, approached her, her eyes shining with pride. "That was magnificent, Sarah. Truly. You laid your soul bare, and it was beautiful." Genevieve hesitated, then added softly, I saw Julian recently at a charity auction. He looks utterly lost, darling, haunted." A pang of old sorrow, a ghost of what was, twisted in Seraphina's chest, but she forced a small, composed smile. "Thank you for telling me, Jen. But I can't let myself dwell on that. It still hurts too much." Fate, however, has a peculiar way of orchestrating unexpected encounters, of weaving threads you thought had long been severed. Seraphina was at the bustling downtown offices of the Vance Hayes Initiative, a place she still visited regularly to oversee the programs she had helped create. She had retained her role on the board, a small, fierce act of defiance, a refusal to let Julian's betrayal erase everything they had once built together. As she was reviewing applications for a new round of scholarships, the receptionist, Liam Bryant, Julian's former fiercely loyal personal assistant, now, surprisingly, dedicating his considerable organizational skills to the foundation, buzzed her intercom, his voice hesitant. "Miss Hayes, Mr. Vance is here. He says it's about the annual budget review. He's asking if you have a moment." Her heart leaped into her throat, a frantic, trapped bird. Julian, here. She hadn't seen him, truly spoken to him beyond curt, legally mandated exchanges in almost 2 years. Composing herself with an effort that cost her dearly, she took a deep breath. She couldn't refuse. It was, after all, as much his foundation as hers. "Send him in, Liam," she said, her voice cooler, steadier than she felt. She steeled her nerves, reminding herself to remain professional, detached. Julian entered her small, sunlit office, looking weary, older than his years, but sincere. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet, almost hesitant deference. He offered a small, uncertain smile that didn't quite reach his haunted eyes. "Seraphina, thank you for seeing me." "Julian," she acknowledged, gesturing coolly to the chair opposite her desk. "Let's keep this brief. What do you need regarding the budget?" He swallowed, the sound audible in the suddenly tense room. The board suggested significantly raising the scholarship fund, given Vance Corp's improved financial outlook this quarter. "I wanted to get your thoughts before formalizing the proposal." He handed her a detailed spreadsheet. She scanned it, forcing herself to focus on the numbers, to ignore the memories, the ghosts that threatened to resurface, to ignore the familiar, subtle scent of his cologne. A scent that had once meant comfort, security, love. Their meeting was uncomfortably cordial, strictly business, with neither acknowledging the emotional minefield that lay between them, the vast, unspoken history. When they had concluded the formalities, Julian lingered, his hand resting on the doorknob. I'm glad you're still involved here, Sarah," he said, his voice soft, almost tentative. "Your passion for these students, for this work, it was always inspiring." She nodded curtly, her gaze fixed on a framed photograph of a smiling scholarship recipient on her desk. "It was important to me. It still is." A pause stretched thick with unspoken words, with years of pain and regret. He looked at her then, his eyes filled with a longing so profound, so raw, it almost made her flinch. "Seraphina," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "I know it's not my place, but could we possibly talk sometime? Properly? Not about budgets or foundations, but about us? About what happened?" Her heart thumped painfully in her chest. She recalled the betrayal, the humiliation, the endless nights spent weeping into her pillow, the sheer soul-crushing agony of it all. The old wounds, though scarred over, still ached with a phantom pain. Yet she also, in that same betraying instant, remembered the sound of his laughter, the way he used to gently tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the feeling of his hand in hers. "No," she told herself fiercely. "This conversation changes nothing. He is not the man you loved." She met his pleading gaze, her own carefully blank. "I don't think that's a good idea, Julian," she responded, her voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil within. "There's nothing left to say." He gave a hollow, almost imperceptible nod, the light in his eyes dimming further. I understand." Turning, he left quietly, leaving behind the faintest trace of that once comforting cologne, not an aching void in the room. That night, Seraphina wrestled with conflicting emotions. She yearned to move forward, to leave the ghost of Julian Vance firmly in the past. Yet, she couldn't deny the curious, unwelcome pang his haunted eyes had evoked in her. It was just residual attachment, she told herself firmly. After all, you can't spend years loving someone, building a life with them, and then simply feel nothing. But she also reminded herself, with a fierce, protective anger, how deeply, how irrevocably he had hurt her. Days later, during a surprise, unseasonable downpour that lashed Nova City, turning the streets into dark, slick ribbons, Seraphina was leaving a small art gallery in the Havenwood district. As she fumbled with her umbrella, a familiar voice called her name, cutting through the drumming rain. "Seraphina!" She turned, her heart lurching, to see Julian jogging towards her through the deluge. no umbrella, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, his expensive suit already soaked. "Sarah, please," he gasped, slightly out of breath as he reached her, raindrops streaming down his face. "I saw your car. Please, just give me 1 minute, one coffee, that's all I ask." Her first instinct was to turn, to flee, to escape back into the fragile peace she had so painstakingly built. But something in his eyes, a raw desperation, a genuine contrition she hadn't seen before, made her pause. The city was a gray, blurred watercolor around them, the rain a curtain isolating them in that moment. She waited, silent, as he caught his breath, blinking away the rain that mingled with what looked suspiciously like unshed tears. "I've been wanting to talk to you for so long, Sarah," he said, his voice raw, vulnerable. "I know I have no right to ask, but please, can we just get a coffee, just to talk properly?" She searched his eyes, seeing the ghosts of their past, the pain of their present, and perhaps, just perhaps, a flicker of something else. Hope? Redemption? Or was it just her own wishful thinking? The memories of his betrayal, the searing images from those photographs, still flared, but time and her own hard-won healing had softened the jagged edges of her rage, leaving behind a deep, resonant ache that had slowly begun to mend. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years, she finally answered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "All right, Julian, one coffee." They ducked into a nearby, unassuming cafe, shaking off the water like two bedraggled birds seeking shelter from a storm. Settling at a small, secluded table by the window, the rain lashing against the glass, they ordered cappuccinos, a shared unspoken memory of simpler, happier times when a shared coffee had been a prelude to laughter, to dreams, to love. Julian looked at her then, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer conceal. "Sarah, I?" Julian takes a shaky breath, the words he's rehearsed 1,000 times in his mind, in the silent, echoing expanse of his therapy sessions, in the dead of night when sleep offered no escape from his tormented conscience, suddenly feeling inadequate, hollow. "Sarah, he began, his voice thick with an emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. The barista, the young woman with kind eyes and an air of discreet incuriosity, set down 2 steaming cappuccinos, their swirling latte art patterns a fleeting, beautiful art. Much like the delicate, almost imperceptible peace that was attempting to settle between these 2 souls, so profoundly shattered by betrayal. The aroma of rich coffee and warm milk mingled with the scent of rain-washed city streets drifting in from the slightly ajar cafe door, a fragile bridge between their fractured past and this uncertain, unwritten present. In the quiet intimacy of the small cafe, cocooned from the storm that still raged outside, Julian finally voiced his profound, soul-deep regret. "It wasn't just for the affair," he explained, his words tumbling out in a rush of raw, unfiltered honesty, "but for the slow, insidious neglect of their love, for the towering arrogance that had blinded him to what truly mattered, for the immeasurable pain he had inflicted upon her, the woman he had once sworn to cherish and protect above all others." He didn't ask for reconciliation. He knew with a certainty that was a fresh stab of agony that he didn't deserve it, that some bridges, once burned, could never be rebuilt. He asked only for a chance to apologize, truly apologize, without excuses, without justifications. Seraphina listened, her gaze fixed on the swirling patterns in her cup, her heart a tumultuous sea of conflicting emotions. The old, searing anger had dulled with time, softened by the slow, arduous process of healing, but the ache, a deep, resonant sorrow, remained. As Julian spoke, his voice raw with a remorse that seemed genuine, she allowed herself to truly hear him, perhaps for the first time since that terrible, life-altering day. When he finally fell silent, his confession hanging heavy in the air between them, she slowly raised her eyes to meet his. She saw not the confident, ruthless billionaire who had conquered the world, but a broken man, haunted by his own demons, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. She, in turn, shared her devastation, the humiliation that had clung to her like a shroud, the shattering loss of her dreams for their future, for the child they had both so eagerly anticipated. She spoke of the lonely nights, the public scrutiny, the feeling of her very identity being erased, subsumed by the scandal. Tears were shed by both, quiet, cleansing tears of sorrow, of truths finally spoken, of a shared grief for what had been so carelessly, so tragically lost. When she finished, her voice a raw whisper, she looked at him, a fragile strength in her gaze. "Thank you for saying that, Julian," she managed, a watery smile touching her lips. "It means something, more than you know." She told him about her poetry, about how the raw anguish of her heartbreak had, paradoxically, become the crucible for her art. How echoes of a shattered dawn had given voice not just to her pain, but to her resilience, her rediscovery of self. She spoke of her new life in the Havenwood district, simpler, quieter, but undeniably hers. She spoke of the quiet strength she had found within herself, a strength she never knew she possessed. He, in turn, told her about his therapy, about the painful, ongoing process of confronting his own monumental failings. He spoke of his rededication to the Vance Hayes initiative, how he was now trying to honor her original vision for it, focusing on programs that nurtured creativity and supported those on the margins. A quiet, desperate attempt to make some small amends, to build something positive from the ruins of his own making. He mentioned the letter then, the one he had written in the depths of his despair, the confession he hadn't dared to send. "I wrote it all down, Sarah," he said, his voice hesitant. "Everything I couldn't say then, everything I needed you to know. It's in my desk drawer. I can give it to you if you want it." Seraphina hesitated, her heart giving a curious flutter. A part of her, the part that still mourned the Julian she thought she knew, yearned to read those words, to understand, perhaps, the why of it all. But another, stronger part, the part that had fought so hard for her healing, for her independence, knew that some doors were best left closed. "Maybe some things are better left in the past, Julian," she said gently, her voice surprisingly firm. I've written my own closure, in my own way." The unread letter would remain his burden, his private penance. Her story was now hers to write, in her own words, on her own terms. They talked then about the mysterious benefactor grant, the anonymous gift that had arrived so many years ago. Julian, a wry, self-deprecating smile touching his lips, confessed he'd always harbored a suspicion that it was from a disgruntled business rival, someone trying to unnerve him, to gain some sort of psychological leverage during a particularly brutal takeover battle he'd been embroiled in at the time. "I was so paranoid back then, Sarah," he admitted, shaking his head. "Saw threats and conspiracies in every shadow. It never even occurred to me that it might have been genuine, altruistic. It was a small, almost insignificant detail in the grand, tragic tapestry of their story, but it added another layer to his past paranoia. A subtle shading to the complex, flawed man he was. The encrypted USB drive, the one Isabel had so desperately tried to access, was never mentioned. Some of Julian's past complexities, his corporate secrets, remained his own, ghosts he would continue to wrestle with in private. As they finally rose to leave the small, steamy cafe, the rain outside had softened to a gentle, cleansing drizzle. The storm, both literal and metaphorical, had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, yet irrevocably altered. On the rain-slicked Nova City street, under the pearlescent gray sky, Julian offered a tentative hand. Seraphina met it with her own, their handshake firm, yet tinged with a profound, bittersweet sadness, acknowledgement, acceptance, perhaps even a fragile, nascent form of forgiveness, not necessarily of each other, but of themselves, of the flawed human choices that had led them to this moment. Then, with a final, lingering look, a silent acknowledgement of all that had been and all that could never be again, they turned and walked in opposite directions, each towards a future irrevocably shaped by their shared, tumultuous past, but no longer solely defined by its pain, its heartbreak. The camera of life, if you will, pans out. We see Seraphina, a few months later, walking confidently down a sun-dappled street in the Havenwood district, a manuscript tucked under her arm, on her way to meet her friend Chloe Sharma at their favorite independent bookstore. There's a genuine, unforced smile on her face, a lightness in her step. Her journey was far from over, but she was healing, growing, her spirit, once so battered, now rekindled by the quiet power of her own words, her own resilience. And Julian? We see him at a Vance Hayes Initiative event, perhaps the awarding of a new scholarship. He's interacting with the young, hopeful students, his expression more somber, more thoughtful than it once was, the arrogant glint in his eyes replaced by a quiet, searching humility. He's still a king, yes, but his throne is no longer built on the shifting sands of ambition and ego. but on a dawning understanding of responsibility, of consequence, of the quiet dignity of trying to make amends, however imperfectly. The story ends not with a grand, sweeping romantic reunion, not with the fairy tale ending so often peddled in dreams. Instead, it concludes with the quiet, profound dignity of two individuals who have navigated immense pain, stared into the abyss of their own failings, and have found separate, meaningful paths to a fragile, hard-won peace. They will forever carry the echoes of their shattered dawn, the indelible scars of betrayal and loss. But they also now carry within them the quiet, resilient promise of new sunrises, of unwritten chapters yet to be filled with hope, with purpose, and perhaps eventually with a different, more grounded kind of love. Sometimes the most profound love stories are not about the breathless, easy perfection of happily ever after, but about the courageous, messy, often painful journey through the wreckage. They are about the strength found in rebuilding, one heartfelt word, one forgiven moment, one accepted truth at a time. And in that, perhaps, lies a deeper, more resonant kind of beauty. What do you think? Have you ever found strength in a broken place? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales that explore the intricate, powerful, and often heartbreaking landscape of the human heart. Hey, our wonderful friends, are you still here with us at this hour? If you are, then maybe something in this story has touched your heart in a special way. And now I'd love to take a moment with you to look back at everything, not with judgment, not to say who's right or wrong, but with kindness and understanding. Seraphina went through something very painful. She was hurt, betrayed, and heartbroken. But instead of staying in sadness, she chose to heal. She chose to find her strength again, little by little. She wrote poems, she spent quiet time alone, and she held on to the small, good things that were still left. A famous Stoic once said, "You can't control what happens to you, but you can control how you react." Seraphina did that. She couldn't change the past, but she changed how she moved forward. And that's a powerful thing. So maybe this story reminds you of something in your life. Maybe it gives you a little hope. If it touched your heart, please give it a like, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to our channel. Let's keep telling stories that help us grow, heal, and understand each other a little more.